a warm welcome to you all. So nice to see many of you here. My name is Henriette Barton-Meyer. I work here at Kunsthal Charlottenborg as a curator. And I'm here to welcome you to this house. As most of you will know, the Kunsthal is part of the Art Academy. And we have many exchanges across the courtyards. It's a funny campus. We're spread around, but also come together in meaningful ways, I would say. For instance, we host the annual MFA degree show in the spring. So there's something to look forward to in May next year. We also work some with the teachers, the professors, the lecturers at the academy, and of course we also the big company, the academy, is also housing the center, which is the reason that why you are here today. We're really happy to be able to host the part of the symposium here at the Kunsthal. So in that respect, with the different dialogues and ways of collaborating across those courtyards, we're both looking into the research and the production and the presentation of contemporary art, and with the institute, with the center, the arts, I guess as such. Tomorrow you'll have we have a house full of exhibitions. Tomorrow you have a VIP opportunity, I think, to see the exhibition by Honeybee Beckerly, which is right upstairs. But if you also feel like seeing what else we have, and if you have the energy for it after a long day today, we're open till 8. So feel free to roam around and see what else is on the program. I think I would like to wish you a great symposium here at Kunsthal Charlottenborg for this part. And also I'd like to thank Kristoffer and Christina and their team, and also the people here for making this framework ready and available for all of you to enjoy. Hopefully some great hours of exchange and of knowledge in the arts. Thank you very much.
Perhaps hear me. Yeah, well, and very loud. So the thanks are definitely reciprocal from the center to Kunsthal Charlottenborg. So thank you, Henriette, again, and also to Michelle for being such wonderful hosts. It's really great to be able to do our fourth, I think it is, symposium of the International Center for the Knowledge of the Arts. Now here we are housed by the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts in the front of the building. So we are kind of part of the same family, but we are also this cross-institutional entity that works with artistic research, across 7 institutions of high arts education in Denmark. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that to situate ourselves in a context, and in the context of the thematic of this symposium as well. But first I would like to actually not speak and play you a video clip as an introduction. So let's see if I can manage to put on a little bit of sound. Well, it's not. It might come in a while, don't worry. So I'd like to show you a clip from the artistic duo and community project Black Quantum Futurism, which also are known as More Mother and Rashida Phillips. They did a performance in 2017 at a festival that I did called Transmediale, so they were like the opening act, and this is that particular a snippet of that performance done at another festival later in that same year, because I didn't have the documentation from our event. I wanted them actually to open this event here, but they've grown so extremely busy in the meantime, so they couldn't make it. But so this will then be a kind of a short virtual ersatz. And it's going to feature Rashida Phillips mainly reading from her, let's say, essayistic and very poetic reconfigurations of Western space-times. Is there sound now from this computer? Yeah. Yeah, no, wait. I have to go. This computer seems to be a bit dead. Oh my God, it's gone. Wait. There it is. I don't know what happened. It crashed in the meantime, apparently, while I was waiting for this to happen. Sorry, I'll have to restart the player. Yeah. Wow. This becomes like avant-garde. Yeah, this is not another glitch art performance, but almost. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. One moment, I will restart VLC. No, I will fix it. So. Yeah. Yes. Oh no, that's Lucia's presentation. My God. Yeah. What is this? No. There. So you don't get the elegant. I had prepared actually a loop. So BQF was, their performance was starting with a loop, and then I could play it, but apparently it crashed. So. Oh my God, no, this is not true. Now. So now it's not going to be as elegant, but wait.
Reverse it so that you see the
And we're going to watch just a few minutes of this.
for the first time.
Etymologically, future developed out of Old French futur during the late 14th century, meaning a time after the present, or that which is yet to be. Future can be further traced back to the Latin futurus, via the stem fu, to grow or to become, which is the future participle of the word essay, or to be. The Oxford Dictionary notes that both essay and future share be at their root, which may explain why the word before can both denote an event that has already passed and is now in the past, or an event that has not yet happened. Notions of the future as that which lies ahead vary greatly. In traditional indigenous African spatio-temporal consciousness, for example, time was experienced as a matter of pacing, akin to walking, with the time beginning when you arrive at your destination. African time has also been said to have a backwards linearity, in that when events occur, they immediately move backwards towards what John Mbiti calls Zamani time, or macro time. Future events are situated in potential time until experienced or actualized. Those events do not depend on a specific clock time or calendar dates for their manifestation. Instead, time depends on the quality of the event and the person experiencing it.
So we already had the welcome. I should maybe say that my name is Kristoffer Gansing, and I'm professor at the International Center for Knowledge in the Arts. We already arrived at the future because we got it off a bit late, I realize, but I'll have to still run through my introduction. So together with my dear colleagues Kristina Marie Jespersen and Gro Sarau, I put together this symposium for you. And as I said, it's nice to maybe kind of situate ourselves, not only in terms of time, space, but also institutionally and contextually and thematically. So for those of you who are maybe not so familiar with the setup of the center, as I said, we work across these 7 institutions. So not only the School of Visual Arts here at the Academy of Fine Arts, but also the National Film School, the National School of Performing Arts, 4 music conservatories, the Royal Danish Music Conservatory here in Copenhagen, the Royal Academy of Music in Aarhus and Aalborg, and the Danish National Academy of Music, as well as the Rhythmic Music Conservatory, which you have an opportunity to visit tomorrow. Some of you are also probably working there. So we are tasked at the center with developing and, let's say, contextualizing artistic research at these schools as part of their so-called knowledge base. So you have artistic practice and you have artistic research. And we try to kind of approach this through, let's say, building a common transdisciplinary vocabulary, talking together about the different methodologies, the different traditions of artistic practice that exist across these schools. So with a respect also to the idiosyncrasies of the different disciplines. But that said, we are really this, let's say, place for trying to synthesize and work with artistic research, I like to say, in a transversal way. And this, I think, is important if we consider that when we say artistic research, we might mean a lot of different things when we come from different contexts. Here in Denmark, if you translate artistic research back to Danish, it's actually translated as kunstnerisk udviklingsvirksomhed, which means literally artistic development activity. So that is different from, if we say, künstlerische Forschung in Germany or konstnärlig forskning in Sweden. And kunstnerisk udviklingsvirksomhed is actually formally not research in the sense of scientific research. It doesn't have proper scientific research funding or PhD programs like in other countries. But there are hybrids, there are collaborations through universities through which artists still do PhDs here. We will meet one tomorrow, as Henriette already mentioned, Hani Biba-Bekeli. And then we have a funding program for projects within this, let's say, this field of artistic development activity at the institutions. So that's a field where staff members primarily at these art schools can develop an aspect of their practice further through a research-like process. So I'm giving you a little bit of this context. I know I can't like make a full picture of it, but just to kind of remind ourselves that we have the PhD student working with artistic research, for example, we're doing practice-based research work. We have the artistic professor who is doing a 1 to 2 year long project, or we have also simply the independent artists that work in let's say research-based ways. And with this symposium, we don't actually have an agenda to advance one over the other. We try to embrace all of them in this kind of transversal spirit as a field of practice that can stretch over these different contexts. But that said, at the same time, I think it's important to stress the infrastructural needs of this field, and that there is a certain urgency. This is something we'll get into in the discussion tomorrow also, that this symposium also tries to kind of advance a discussion on the urgency of artistic research today in terms of, for example, what kind of infrastructure and resources that it has. And why? Because there are so many other urgencies on a planetary scale that we need to deal with today. Why then artistic research? So that's maybe something we can debate. But I think this potential in this field for long-term, genre-defying, sustainable practices can be generative of, let's say, a kind of unconventional and multi-dimensional thinking that is indeed very urgently needed today. And that brings me to skip through the center to this theme of transformative futures. So it has also this long subtitle, Reimaginations of Time, Space and Materiality in Artistic Research. Regarding the term future, this is something that I have promised myself at some point never to use in any event title. Now it's there, but the reason why it's usually problematic is that it's kind of allied to a certain tech optimism, a belief in, let's say that in kind of a Western teleological sense that we're always kind of progressing towards a better future, kind of a civilizational thinking that has been very prevalent. And today we might have another kind of sense of where we're heading as humanity. I think that those kind of visions become problematic. But I'd like to still try to recuperate this term within this symposium and through this idea also of the transformative. And one way we can do that is maybe to kind of think more of how the future is produced. So I'd like to introduce this very famous quote by George Orwell from 1984. This is the party slogan that goes, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." So for me, this is something which seems very applicable to the way that, let's say, contemporary digitalized societies and the production of knowledge and the production of the future and how that's interconnected, in the sense that past and present data is being collected constantly and analyzed in order to produce information on, let's say, possible future paths of action in science, in business, in art and cultural production as well. But if we think about, let's say, planetary scale challenges that we face today within, and that we are feeling on our own bodies, even in the climate emergency and the pandemic, we also might need a more radical reimagination of how knowledge comes about and how this kind of futures comes about that moves beyond this linear, even though there are feedback models, they have a certain kind of systematic linearity to them. And can we engage in other types of, let's say, active future making through the means of artistic research? So this theme is inspired by how artistic researchers and indeed maybe artists and practitioners more generally today in recent years have turned to alternative imaginaries, epistemologies, deep time cosmologies that challenge the linear conceptions of time, but also the extractive material kind of logics that often underpin Western rational and these datafied approaches to knowledge production. So actually transformative in this title means transforming the very idea of the future, as well as it means working towards, let's say, materially different futures. So a nonlinear, mutable concept of the future, which should also then imply a mutable concept of the past. So the past as being always in need of critical reinterpretation in order to create then more livable presence. So that's kind of the grand vista, and just to kind of situate it perhaps a bit more concretely in contemporary culture, I think it seems like we are very much living in times that are open to, let's say, multidimensional, non-linear thinking, precisely because time seems to be running out for humankind. There is this desire also for other temporalities, other space-times. I mean, we see it in, you know, the craze for like multiverse narratives. Think films like Everything Everywhere All at Once, or even like Marvel blockbusters like Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, where feature stories where time and space are not givens, but rather infinitely variable. And in the art world also, last week I attended an opening at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin of this exhibition Ceremony, Burial of an Undead World, which asks the sub-question, how do we develop new futures from the ruins of the capitalist present? So we're not going to be giving a definite answer to this in this humble event, but I think, you know, we have a benefit of a rather intimate and ironically also linear program where we can think through some of these artistic remediations of time, space, and materiality. So I'm looking very much forward to spending these 2 days with this program, which is in very small print, I see. But you have it also in the folder. I'm not going to go through it now, except to say that, well, after me, I will shortly introduce Lucia Derico, who will give an opening speech or an opening keynote. And she will then engage in conversation with Ole Lützow-Holm. And tomorrow, it starts already at 10, and it's going to be up in the upper foyer here, outside of the exhibitions or in between the exhibitions. And we move then, guided by the artist Honeybee Babekli through her exhibition Digital Matters, which was also a PhD work, and which I think ties a lot of these thematic threads that I tried to paint up here in a way, in a nice way together, speaking about the connection between crafts and digital infrastructures and these histories together. And as you see, we'll have a conversation between her and Jussi Parikka afterwards. And then the program goes on. And I think it's just important here to mention that we move venues tomorrow night to the Rhythmic Music Conservatory for a sort of diffractive listening session / concert / presentation called Traversing Sonic Territories. We'll introduce it more in full tomorrow. But there is also a social event there right before at 5:45, a reception where there are also some light snacks, and it would, in this very tight program, be a nice opportunity to have a more social get-together. So that's what we have served up. I'm going to introduce now, happily, Lucia Derico, and she's a researcher and musician, also a visual artist, with a specialization in artistic research that focuses on experimental performance practices. And she performs also on guitar and other plucked stringed instruments. And she has this particular interest and focus in Western notated art music from the 20th and 21st centuries. She has a PhD from the KU Leuven in the Doc Artist program, and is also active interdisciplinary, which I think is great for this context, as a graphic artist, as a video performer. And she's currently professor of artistic research at the Mozarteum University in Salzburg, where she's also part of, she leads, co-directs a new transdisciplinary PhD program in the arts. And she has published books, Powers of Divergence, an experimental approach to music performance in 2018, and the anthology she co-edited with Paulo de Assis, Artistic Research, Charting a Field in Expansion in 2019. And she will be giving this talk, Linearity and Divergence, Artistic Research, and the Reconfiguration of the Musical Past, building on her own previous artistic research practice, expanding into the discussion also of the future roles that is usually given to composers, performers, and listeners. And I will introduce, after her talk, Ole Lützow-Holm, who will actually be giving a response and moderate the discussion with her. But before that, we will actually have a break. I'm well aware that this room is sometimes a challenge in terms of temperature and humidity and so on. So we will have a short 15-minute break after her talk, but please then try to make it back in time so that we can continue. So with that, Lucia, I give you the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kristoffer, for this very kind introduction, and to the team for having me here. And to all of you, it's great to see such a great audience and also our online audience. It's actually a pleasure as well as an honor to present and discuss my work and my approach to artistic research in such an important event here. So, in my abstract, I promised to you and also to myself to connect a very specific, very limited practice, such as the performance of musical scores in the Western tradition, with a very general horizon, the horizon of global capitalism, through artistic research. And while rereading this abstract to myself, and even now when I say this sentence, I'm somehow struck by the over-ambitiousness and also to a certain extent absurdity of this task. But I decided to stay with this absurdity and to try in this over-ambitious enterprise because for two specific reasons, first of all. Because I would like to underline the potential of artistic research to start from a very limited, very situated practice, very specific, and but at the same time to reach out not only to the community of peer artists, not only to the wider horizon of discursive practices, but also to a horizon that is beyond art, and that concerns us all, whether we want it or not, whether we are aware of it or not. And the second reason is that lately, as probably most of you, I have been repeatedly struck by the pressure that especially institutional policies pose to artists, namely to take active responsibility in the face of ongoing crises. Of course, environmental crisis, the urgency of redefining previous discriminatory practices, etc. In short, there is a call for the relevance of art and the relevance of artistic research. So while I subscribe to this call, I find it also quite problematic for certain aspects. But even more problematic, I find the way in which some artists and artist researchers respond to this call in a way that sometimes is very representative, reflective in the sense of, in a sense that comes from post-human discourse, no, as opposed to diffractive, so a kind of mirroring of problems that are outside of art, and of course in the worst case is a bit self-defensive as well. So today I would like to make a claim that even a practice that is so apparently straightforward, innocuous, innocent, and to some extent I would say even obsolete, such as composing scores, performing scores, listening to scores. So even such a simple practice, apparently simple of course, does have profound connections to system of power, of hierarchies, and of capitalization of perception, knowledge, and, as we will see, time and space and materiality, which is the topic of today's symposium. So, again, while I think this call is very urgent, is very valid, it concerns us all, I would like to propose today what I call a modest response to it, and I'm happy that Kristoffer already mentioned that this is a humble symposium. So art is also only art, but it's also always more than art. So in this, I would also like to advocate for what I call the micro-political power of artistic research. So, you know, by opening the tiny spaces where passages of power and materialities take place, we can actually address and have an impact on macro political structures in a way that probably cannot be demonstrated, cannot be quantified, cannot be directly appreciated, but can still be discussed. And I think this is the great value of artistic research, that we share dialogue about how this might happen. So to do so, I will perform my favorite double move of artistic research in two moments that I think are fundamental for any research perhaps, but particularly for us artists, which is a phase of critique and a phase of constitution. So to me, critique is important because I don't conceive of research without a certain dissatisfaction or dissensus towards a certain status quo. But of course, constitution, and here the theme of future, or maybe to use a better term, futurity of a practice comes into play. And of course, with constitution comes also, I think, the necessity of being generous about one's own practice and one's own limitations. So by constituting new practices, we can also offer new limits to discuss with each other. So, what is actually my criticism directed towards? It's directed towards the activity that as an artist I know best, because before entering artistic research, which was 8 years ago now, I was working as a professional in a very specific field, the field of music interpretation. So I was a trained classical guitarist, and I started with classical and early music to then embrace new music, but always, and this is very important, with a very specific, very strong connection to music notation, no? To the score, to writing in our Western musical tradition. And while doing my PhD, I realized, I gradually came to realize what my actual terrain of criticism, what my, so to speak, field of war was, which is a very simple sentence. It's not even a sentence, it's an ensemble of words that is very banal, is very straightforward. It's the performance of rhythm music, okay? Very easy. We all know what it means to a certain extent. And I always like, you know, when we have this banality in front of us, this, yeah, we all agree with this common sense, this common understanding of sentences, because the most obvious language and practices are, the more they tend to hide something. So transparency, my understanding, is always that which hides something that has to be uncovered, of course. So the more I looked and reflected upon, of course, my experience within this sentence, the performance of rhythm music, the more I realized how it's actually very complex. Well, first of all, it's clearly made of two sides, no? The side of rhythm music, the side of performance. And quite clearly, these two sides hide or keep with them a series of other further dichotomies. First of all, subject and object. So very clearly, rhythm music stands for a series of objective or culturally shared information, whereas the side of performance is where the subject comes in with her own experiences, histories, relationalities, bodily involvements, etc. Adorno himself said, interpretation is all about striking this balance between subject and object. Okay. And of course, very clearly, when we relate to rhythm music in this tradition, we deal with the couple past, present, or past, future. So no matter how recent a score is, no, it could have been written this morning, the fact that it is sedimented through a certain system of science means that it is a past, it represents a past. And its performance is always its future. So there is this chronological dualism. All of this very obvious, but we start seeing how many things unfold from this simple sentence. And of course, with the chronological couple comes the teleological couple. So the score is always a moment of origin in time. And this origin emits something that then regards the moment of performance as the aim, as the telos of this movement, as the accomplishment as well. And of course, this origin telos brings about also a kind of Platonic understanding. So there is a model, an ideal somewhere that has to be copied. And this also brings about a hierarchical direction from something that is purer, more original, more authentic, to someone or something that reproduces it. So there's also this production and reproduction relationship. To end perhaps, and this is really not a big exaggeration on my side, with a theological relationship. So the fact that we have this text always implies a kind of demigod, a kind of hyper subject or hyper object, super object behind the score, which is the composer, and then the one who can, you know, interpret this text and infer the correct intentions of the composer is a sort of priest. And we have the master-slave dialectics of Hegel. So all of this is contained in this very simple and banal sentence. And of course, these two sides are very dynamic, no? So there is an ongoing renegotiation of what rhythm music was performances, and actually lately we have witnessed so many movements of, rethinking this hierarchy, which is very strong on the side of rhythm music. We had the field of performance studies, but also artistic research very much so, advocating for, performance as a form of writing in itself, as a form of knowledge production in itself. Okay? Good. However, what, to my understanding, has not so much been paid attention to and actually constitutes my tiny, specific, very situated field of research and of dissensus is a word of this sentence that we don't, it's a transparency in the transparency. So it's hyper-transparency, and it's the word off. It's my favorite word. I always talk about this, the word off, the performance of rhythm music, okay? So while doing my research, I started thinking, what is this off made of? What happens in this off? What happens so powerful that we can actually, take these two sides so different from each other and say that they resemble each other, no? So the side of rhythm music with its very clear materiality, which is linear, which is perceived as two-dimensional, which is not resonating very clearly, which is symbolic and very mental, with the side of performance that does not respond to all of these categorizations. So what is this off? To try and understand this off, I was drawn to another artistic practice, which actually comes from very far away in time, not so much in geography. It comes from a very specific year, 1425, and a very specific place, namely a square in Florence. And it is the moment when the technique of linear perspective was codified by Filippo Brunelleschi. So actually almost exactly 600 years ago. I think we should, in 3 years' time, we should do a celebration of this event, because it is very remote, but its consequences are still very much with us today. Speaking of time and space. So I would like to, probably the experiment is known to some of you, but I would like to rehearse it again. So let's see if I can find, for some reason, okay. Yes. So the drawing is a bit strange, but I'll try to explain what happened back then. So Filippo Brunelleschi decided to codify a technique of drawing. I think most of you are familiar with it. It's based on the convergence of lines, of geometric lines, to represent three-dimensional spaces onto a two-dimensional surface. So what he did, he painted, using linear perspective, he painted an image of a building in Florence, the Florentine baptistry, onto a board, okay? Then, so this is the board. Then he drilled a hole in the place of the vanishing point, which is the spot where all these lines converge, and that actually, when you look at a building or at a street or at a city, is the place of the eye. So when you move your eyes, the vanishing point shifts. And then, and this is genius from Brunelleschi, he invited people to look. So he placed this board in front of the real image, the real baptistry, the real building in the public square. And he invited people to do what this guy is doing in this image, to look from behind the painting through the hole, so that at first they saw the real baptistry. And then the miracle happens. Brunelleschi inserted a mirror between the painted image and the real image, and the people of Florence could see that in the insertion of the mirror, the two images came to correspond perfectly. So Brunelleschi is not only codifying a practice, but is showing that this way of represented reality coincides with reality as it is. And still today, this is with us, okay? When we use photographs and videos, that's how it works. It's very simple. So why am I interested in this? Because in constructing this correspondence, this clear, transparent, easy correspondence that we don't question anymore after 600 years, what is it doing? It's constructing the off. The off is, first of all this machine. Okay, all this situation is the off. The mirror as a middle term, as something that embodies, the Euclidean geometry that is embedded in reflection and in the human retina. So he's using this technology. But also he's doing three things. First of all, he's assuming that the space is observed as if through a window. So there is a distance between the observer and the space. There is no haptic involvement. There is no touching. There is no, direct, there's no smell in this. There is the painting has become a window. Importantly, second, time is still. Time has stopped, okay? So the premise for this experiment to work is that the viewer is immobilized in the only right position that corresponds to the vanishing point, okay? As a consequence, and I'm glad that we had this introduction by Black Quantum Futurism, this is the moment when our time and our space become infinite, homogeneous, infinitely categorizable. And this is also a great moment for democracy, because this space it can be occupied by anyone. Okay, so time and space infinite means that we all can occupy this space. There is no more central gravitation around the big centers of power. Of course, it was back then. It was a different time. But the third thing is perhaps the most important, and yeah, to this time we accept this in our use of photography and video, that one eye is eliminated from vision. Okay, the people have to watch through the hole like this. There are cyclops. What does it mean? That Filippo Brunelleschi is eliminating from the viewer, from the subject, the very source of internal difference. No, we have two eyes and we experience the world visually as a synthesis of two eyes that are very different from each other. No, he's taking one apart. And so I claim that 200 years before Descartes, we have, you know, the creation of a human subject that coincides with itself, and by virtue of this, can project itself outside onto the world. What does it mean? That the environment, the outside, becomes understood as the projection of a human subjectivity, with all the consequences that are still with us today. I have to cut things short because we don't have much time, but I hope it's understandable how this has to do with our own approach to the world we live, our own, of course, in terms of society and culture. Making a jump, 2004, I think it was, Apple launches the first iPod. I think most of us remember it very well. And this is a projection, again, of this moment, of the individual person that with its own unicity, subjectivity, projects its own taste onto the world. This time the economic world and the world then, of course, of internet search. So Brunelleschi is still with us, even in so-called surveillance capitalism. This is the gesture. Now, let's go back to music notation. So how is this gesture replicated, contained in this very apparently innocuous activity of performing musical score, where this off is also constructed in a very artificial manner, and actually it follows to some extent the history of opticality as inaugurated by this experiment. I think the first time that the word composition in the Latin form res facta appears is perhaps 50 years or so after this, by Ioannis Tinctoris. And through these years, through this history of opticality and the way in which opticality appropriates the audible, there is an accumulation of, you know, traditions, knowledges, systems of education. So also transmission of knowledge and tradition, also commonplaces, memories, language. Language is fundamental. When we say a pitch is high or low, what does it mean? There's nothing high or low in the, you know, affective bodily perception of sound. That's a convention. And all of this constitutes this off. So this off is loaded. This off is the whole history of Western music. So the assumptions that get transferred in my activity, which is interpretation, are again that the sonic world, the musical world, are understood as if seen through a window. So also the page of the score becomes this window through which the audible, the infinitely unknown audible, is filtered. By consequence, notation seems to have the capacity to exhaust and cover the audible. Okay, and this, I mean, many composers speak in this language, that their notation, their way of notating it is exhaustive, whereas certain other scores are not exhaustive enough, as if it was possible. No? But also space and time become infinite, and this is, of course, is not only for music, it's also for museum practices. No? So for us musicians, time is most prominent. Time becomes, you know, this infinite canvas that you can slice up, and you can also substitute pieces from each other. For example, the form of the recital is fantastic in this sense. also the practice of commissioning pieces, you know, you have to write a 10 minutes piece. That's how still today many commissions are made to composers. Write a piece of an hour, okay? But also, all the other linearities become possible, no? So the subject recognizes itself in the object. So the interpreter that interiorizes the score, that makes the scores one's own, provided that he or she coincides with itself, that he or she knows who they are, which I don't, for example. The past coincides with the present. And this is very clear in practices such as historically informed performance practice, where we have this timeline that is a kind of ladder that we walk back until we reach a certain time, and there, you know, we can reconstruct everything, the instruments, the dresses, the lights, etc. But also, we can do the opposite. We can take a past piece and make it walk to our time, actualize it, and this is also a practice that has a history. In the 19th century, people would do it already, maybe also before. The origin communicates with the telos. And then we have this linearity, the composer, again, as origin, that transmits through writing to the performer, that transmits to the listener, again, in a linear fashion. And for some composers, maybe still today, the ideal performer is the one that transmits without noise, etc. So much for the critical part. Now let's come to the constitutive part. And for the constitutive part, I will present my previous research project, which I call Divergent Performances. So it was my proposal in the face of this. My proposal also to project a different series of implications in this practice. So in the old off, according to the old off, these two sides are seen like two kernels. So the linearity between them also makes them coincide with themselves. To a certain extent, to produce an interpretation, we have to close down the piece to a series of objects, the score and maybe some other sources of information. And again, also the performer has to close him or herself down to a kernel. My approach was to reverse this, to create, so to speak, a different off, a different image of the off. So instead of bridging this difference of potentials between the two sides, I decided to amplify it, to bring it to the extreme. And actually, by regarding the two kernels as, so rhythm, music, and performance as two infinitely divergent series. So the musical piece is, of course, embedded in a score, but it is also a certain historical time, a composer. It's a series of influences, past influences and future influences. It's a series, Paolo d'Assis, with whom I was working at the time, said there are innumerable things belonging to a musical work, instruments, letters, sketches, you name it. But at the same time, also myself, the performer, am an infinite series. No? This time I'm like this, in a moment I'm already different. I have two eyes, I do not coincide with myself. So this, I see these two cones, maybe. Oh no, there's a weird yellow line that does not belong to my drawing, but it's okay. I think you get the message. They are like two kinds of Leibnizian monads. So they are closed in themselves. They do not communicate with each other. But at the same time, they have this opening, infinite opening. Leibniz says the monad is like a window, like a point of view on the city. So they communicate in some strange way with everything. So I tried to look for a kind of common denominator between these two not communicated entities, but of course, as simply represented in this drawing, you see that this common denominator happens very far from both. So in my practice of Divergence, I tried to get very much outside of the score of what I call the primary work. So to bring it out of its own history, of its own, determination in some sense, but also to bring myself outside of me. So through the affection that I was experiencing from this primary work, to exit my own territory, to the point that it's not even me which was creating these divergent performances, but someone that I call the operator. So I was not either a composer recomposing old music, nor a performer, but there was something like an operator. I recently found this definition of operator in the famous book by Jane Bennett, Vibrant Matter, which was perfect for this occasion. I quote, "An operator is that which by virtue of its particular location in an assemblage and the fortuity of being in the right place and the right time makes the difference, makes things happen, becomes the decisive force catalyzing an event." So it was not even myself, but the relationship between myself and the musical work was catalyzed by an operator. Now, I think to better explain how this works, maybe we listen to an example of divergent performance. It's one of my favorite examples, and it's taken from a duet by Claudio Monteverdi in his opera L'Incoronazione di Poppea. For some reason, this process worked at first better for me with very early music, because precisely I had this, very big distance that allowed me to concentrate on the difference of potential between my time and Monteverdi's time. The drawback of this process is that every time I present my divergent performances, we also have to listen to the primary work, because if you don't listen to it, something fundamental might escape. So we listen to a couple of minutes of the duet by Monteverdi, and then I show my divergent performance. Then I will show the divergent performance of it, and after I will explain some processes of how I made it, which might sound very mysterious to a first listening, are still mysterious to me, actually, after all these years. There is also an element of staging in the video you will see. I won't discuss it now, but if you have questions, maybe later I can say a word about it. This was one example. If we have time, maybe I will show another one. But I would like to say a couple of words on how we pass between the first and the second. So what is this new off? How does it work? So what I deployed is what I, as a methodology really, is what I called techniques of minoration, okay? So I individuated what I call some major traits that actually constitute this off. So the processes that are active in passing from a score to a performance of the convergent kind, so to speak. And I minorated them. So I subtracted. I use a kind of subtractive methodology. So I subtract elements in order for other features of the primary work to emerge. So what kind of elements did I subtract? For example, linearity. Again, linearity is the topic today. And of course, while reading a score, not all scores, of course, work like that, but most scores are read from the top to the bottom in a linear fashion. So what I did here was not, a kind of palimpsest of the original work, but I isolated some pieces, I repeated some of them, I put together some others, I eliminated completely other parts. Okay, so already this very strong marker of stability is eliminated. The second one is very clearly historicity. So when you hear this, it sounds like, you know, a post-Lachemanian concept of composition. There's nothing in what I'm doing that refers to the 17th century, not even the instrument, which Monteverdi never saw in his life. I subtract sonic stability. So as a guitarist, as a classical musician, of course, most of my life has been spent in perfectioning systems for stabilizing sonic emission, pitch, projection. You know, there's a sort of diction of sound that is very clear. Especially with guitar, we work a lot to have a certain timbre, a certain acoustic projection as well. Well, as you heard and saw, I went for very odd and extreme places in the instrument and for grainy texture, for texture that are not clearly classifiable according to a notational system. Of course, notation has this claim that it can cover and classify everything, so it's not totally true. But also, and this is very hard to put my finger on, I tried to subtract my own narrativity, the sense that I am telling a story. So also as a stage presence, I tried to be impassive, almost machinic. I tried to subtract my own subjectivity. These are processes that are very self-contradictory and very hard to demonstrate as well, but that was part of my process as well. In short, the strategy was also saying, how far can I sonically go from the primary work and still retain something of it? But what this something is, again, is defined negatively, subtractively. And the best way I would have to describe it is some intensive properties. So something that in that moment of my encounter between myself and the work through the operator stuck, emerged, were piercing me. Maybe this is something that Roland Barthes would call the punctum, something that struck me. And it's important to say that for some divergent performances, I also did serial instantiation. So there is no one divergent performance. There can be many different of the same work. And actually, if the same method or reasoning was appropriated by someone else, of course, the result, I would expect it to be totally different, also from an aesthetic, the word of aesthetic properties, because also the kind of traits that I individuate in a certain works are linked to my own situatedness. And if someone else with a different situatedness would come up with a different series of parameters to be deducted. So I hope you see how these couples that I mentioned before do not make much sense anymore in this performance, like the past and the present. They are confused, the subject and the object, origin and telos, model and copy. So there was, for some time, I called this simulacra in a Deleuzian sense. So how to reverse the logic of Platonic model and copies. I think we have still some time, but Kristoffer, stop me if I'm, no, okay. So maybe I can show you another example, because actually one of the challenges also for this process was not to work with notation, so not to recompose these works, and also to find ways of inscription that are in themselves performative, that belong to the materiality of the performer and not to those of the composer. So I will show another example also from a very early piece, from a madrigal from Nicola Vicentino, and I will show a different, slightly different modality of divergent performances that uses also electronic inscription, which was a big part of the project. they're not out of tune, but Vicentino was known for a microtonal system. So just to, okay, so let's listen to the Divergent performance of it. Was the second example. I should have got. Yeah. Okay. It's actually quite. Still today, it's quite mysterious for me to appreciate how also different people react to these performances, because some people don't get the you know, what passes through this off is not recognizable at all. It's very chaotic. Some people get it immediately. Some people, my colleagues, like after some years listening to the same examples, told me, now I get it finally. So also to me it's quite mysterious, because again it's this process that operates negatively. and doesn't make sense in itself. So all the time we have to listen to both versions. So to me, this also raises one of the, I think, most important questions for artistic research, namely who listens to this? Because many people told me, okay, just name this your composition. Why, you know, always having to call in Monteverdi and Vicentino? This is your composition that could be easily played in a recital of new music. Yes, of course, but that misses the whole point of the research process, because all of what I presented today is lost. And the question is not solved yet. So also what are the strategies of presenting this work to the audience is not totally clear to me. To me, you are this is the audience of artistic research, people that are willing to engage with the aesthetic and discursive practices that are integral part of it. So this said, I'm very much looking forward to your reaction, to your comments, and also I hope there is some criticism, because I love it. I think it's very healthy. And I thank you very much, and the online audience, for your attention. Thank you.
We will have a 15-minute break, and then we'll gather duly here again for the discussion. But it was an amazingly rich talk of, I won't say what, but because that was the point. But thank you.
Thanks to you.
And there's some water if you need it, and we will continue at Okay, I think we slowly start again. Thank you for being swift in getting back. There might be some people dropping in and some dropped off. I'm just here to introduce the respondent and discussant with Lucia, which is Ole Lützow-Holm. He's a professor of composition at the Academy of Music and Drama at the University of Gothenburg. He's also connected to the center in the sense that he's head of the jury for the Danish Artistic Research Funding Program, known as KUV-puljen to some of you as well. He's coming from a contemporary Central European tradition, I think valid also for this context. He created works for a broad palette of performance and contexts. In recent years, he has explored operational trajectories to elaborate on transient, short-term musical practices inspired by new notions of ambiguity and incompleteness, incorporating elements of improvisation and open form, and often, in many different collaborations with other artists. So, with those words, I'd like to also welcome Ole, and please have a good discussion.
Thanks a lot. And please give me a sign when it's time to open up. We might actually also do it a bit sort of like an improvisation, so that if there are urgent, things coming up, in your minds, and don't hesitate to give me a sign, and we can do that in between. And thank you, Lucia, for a very inspirational talk. And it's like, you speak very much right into parts of my own practice, so it resonates very well. And before coming here, I had the opportunity to read a text by yours, which is called Aberrant Likenesses, where you actually explain your work on Vicentino's Madrigal, Madonna il poco dolce. And I'm so happy that you also gave us, shared the sonic part of that, because I was so wondering, what is this going to sound like when I was reading the article, so it was kind of dumb to me, but now I have an impression in my ear, and I realize also immediately how much it resonates with me and how beautiful I find it. I find it extraordinarily beautiful. Your work on Vicentino and on Monteverdi, the like. And in the article, you talk about a particular strategy that you call resemblance through non-resemblance. You did not mention that today, but I think that's important, that you actually you create resemblance, but you create it with sort of means of non-resemblance. It's like echoing. It's like you extract odors, fragments, gestural qualities from the original. You do not render it, in the way it was once written, but it's like I can say it's a sensuous response that you share. So one of my, sort of a very simple question would be, are you performing a work by Monteverdi, or are you performing a work of your own?
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind words. I am performing a work of Monteverdi, but we should agree on what this of is.
Yeah.
I think I am, of course, but the of has been changed, and actually it's very important what you bring about, because as I mentioned before, many people among my musician colleagues would find my work very acceptable. Oh yeah, sorry. Should I repeat or? Is it on still? Now it's on. Yes. Okay. Now you hear me better. Did you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was saying many of my colleagues would find my work much more comprehensible and acceptable in the moment I would say this is work by Lucia Del Rico,
Exactly.
the author,
Yeah.
and not fussing about it being Monteverdi. But I think its only reason of existence is if I say this is a performance of Monteverdi.
Because what comes to my mind, and what has been also important in my own research, is to look around and see, can I find inspirational strategies, artistic strategies in other places than in music. And then I've turned to theater, and also, of course, also turned to sort of improvisational music, where you find similar practices as well, where you actually make this kind of transformations of tunes, of composed tunes, and you would not expect it to be rendered as it once was written, but actually to be, fantasizing, sort of working on really a transformation of the work. But within theatre, as we all know, the practice is so much more radical or free in relation to the original. When you go and see a play by Shakespeare, King Lear, you do not expect to see sort of the original, but you expect it to be a transformation of Shakespeare's King Lear. So I'm so puzzled, and being in the business of music myself, and facing this on a daily basis, the fright in relation to this kind of proposals, these kind of strategies, where you actually abandon, as it were, the authority of the score, and you encounter the score on different terms. So in your experience, what are we so afraid of? What is the problem? Because within research community you can do this, but the moment you would go on stage, and say, I'm proposing a program with Monteverdi, and then you would come up with this, that would be more or less an impossible thought within the commercial music business. So what is it that we are so afraid of, and what are the power structures at play?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. I think one of the things that makes very difficult to work with music, as is been done in theater, is the evanescence of the sonic dimension. And I think in theater too, actually, the most difficult dimension to address is the dimension of the voice, the role of the voice in the enunciation of the text. Actually, one of the huge inspiration for my work was the work of Carmelo Bene, an actor from working between the 50s and the 90s, who actually did, the traditional plays, Shakespeare and the like. Of course, all the staging was very different, and the text was recomposed to a certain extent. But his claim was that the way he pronounced the text was the most revolutionary. And I think that when dealing with sound, the materiality of sound is so hard to pin down that it seems to require a certain structuring to not enter chaos. And this brings me to a second answer to your question, that I think to obtain this sonic disciplination, musicians actually have the hardest training of all professions. I could perhaps think of ballet dancers and maybe surgeons, but not even. Not even Olympic athletes have such a long training. I mean, in the country I come from, it's 10 years of canonic training for becoming a minimum level of acceptable professionally. Well, I think this is behind the fear. Also for me, I mean, living 30 years of living my profession and my relationship to sound that was shaped so precisely by certain categories was not an easy task, and I think most people are afraid of that, also as listeners probably.
So how would you think of coming out with this kind of knowledge that you are producing through your experimentation, through your research, how can we reach beyond sort of the, I would say, the ghetto to some extent of artistic research as it is today? How can we reach out to a broader community? I mean, both to the professional community who is not involved with research, but also to the audience. How are there strategies for that?
Yes, this is a huge question, of course. And to answer that, I think that we would need to do something very important before, namely agree on what is the audience. Because I have this question, it comes up every now and then in artistic research. And increasingly I wonder, what is the audience? This abstract entity that seems to exist, but nobody has seen it. And I think it is a very precise concept, the audience. Like indeterminate audience is a mass of people, and I think they have precise characteristics. They are, liberal, well-educated, diverse, democratic, and as numerous as possible. The question we would have to agree upon before answering your question is, do we want this audience? Or are we making an audience with artistic research? And we have a wonderful audience here. Is this not an audience? I think it is. So of course it is a ghetto. Artistic research is still a ghetto. And I think the strategies are, finding, building, fabricating the audience, which I think should and can happen in the educational context. Because, as we said, it's the education of musicians, not so much of other kinds of artists, but musicians in general is so predicated upon certain understandings, among which why waste time reading, why waste time thinking about other problems than, your practice, that could be a good spot where to act also very concretely with undergraduate research programs which are happening in Europe, and I would like to happen in my own institution as well. So that for me would be the starting point, rather than always, referring to this abstract audience, which to me is kind of a problematic concept in itself.
Interesting. You mentioned Deleuze's book on Francis Bacon in your article, The Logic of Sensation, and you talked there about two different kinds of analogies. Deleuze talks about two different types of analogy. One where there is a straightforward, direct correlation between the original and the representation, and then he talks about another kind of analogy, and he calls that's where resemblance is produced, as it were, and then he talks about resemblance as a product. Namely, what you then again would call a transposition, or the kind of sort of divergent performances that you are doing. I was just wondering, why do we need the original in your rendering, in your divergent performances? Because we don't have the original in Francis Bacon, do we? We have it as an image. Of course, we have it as an image, and perhaps we share that image to such an extent that we do not longer need to have it present. So is that the reason, or are there other reasons for why you insist on having the original connected to your performance, to your transformation of Monteverdi?
Oh, thank you for this question, because it's actually a good point to make about the relationship between figurative art and music, which famously does not represent anything. No, there's a long story of big sentences about the fact that music is superior, even Schopenhauer, because it does not represent anything. It's the excess directly to emotions. Also, Deleuze falls into the trap, by the way. But I think it depends. I mean, also music is such a general term, and it depends on what kind of music we are speaking about. And I think in this music we are talking about today, there is a very clear representation, and it is this off again. So the score is being represented to a great extent, or the score in turn functions to a certain extent as a representation of what it projects its sonic result to be. Of course, composers don't reason that way all the time, and that's also the big power of writing, that it has the capacity to abstract itself from the need of, a sounding tradition. So we think of a very simply dodecaphony or combinatory practices. They emancipate themselves from sound, which is great, but still they demand for someone to reproduce itself into sound. So to me, this kind of music is absolutely representational. And actually, for the Francis Bacon, Deleuze makes the point that it's not representational, but it is figural. So in a way, it locates itself between abstraction and figuration, and it's none of them. But still, there is this very strong figurative predecessor. There is a spot in that book that was really influential to me when he says, you place yourself in front of an empty canvas and it's not empty. It's full. It's full of all the images you've seen before. And so Francis Bacon, according to Deleuze, does not paint something on the canvas, but starts from this fullness and again subtracts. Yeah. So also Francis Bacon has the need for figuration. He used photographs also a lot as, the paramount of figuration. So again, I need the primary work because that's my action. That's my exiting from an overfull canvas. If I just filled this empty infinite space and time that we talked about, and I would be then what I call a composer, it would be a completely different action. Even if the result, again, the product, could sound similar to a great extent, no?
I agree on you. I agree with you on that. But I was actually thinking about you're insisting on having the original even with you in the performance.
Okay.
Because of course I understand. I mean the original, in a similar way as with Bacon. That is your starting point. That's your very starting point, and that in itself is unique. And without it, it might have sounded similar, but it would not have been similar. So semblance would not exist in the same sense. But you actually insist on having the original in the performance. And is that because we do not actually share the experience, the knowledge of all the, of the figurative in the same sense as we might do with Francis Bacon? Or are there other reasons why you bring the original with you on stage?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I for all of the reasons you're saying, and actually experimented with several strategies because to me it seems a bit blatant always to do this.
Yeah, exactly.
2 moments. Yeah. And actually I didn't do that a lot outside of this kind of format, more presentation, but when I'm on stage I try to do other things. For example, simply having program notes or projections, as you saw in the video, saying, piece by Monteverdi. And that actually caused a problem because there was a person who was also related to my research work who stepped out and said, no, I cannot go on anymore. This is a fraud. He used this term. This is a fraud. And I said, okay, this is doing something. There is, still the need of doing this work, which to me seemed so innocent. So there are several possibilities, and I've not come to a final or best possible strategy.
No.
But I agree with you. There's a risk of being too
Pedagogical.
Pedagogic,
Yes,
yeah,
because I
indeed.
mean that's what you, in a way, you do. You point to
right.
the figure in a way that becomes pedagogical. You know, it's a what you actually do is to create a relief, which is you actually create that distance in a way that you talked about.
Mhm.
So in that sense, it's more than pedagogy. It's also aesthetically, I think, fully acceptable. But I was just wondering, you know, what are the sort of primary reasons why you actually bring it in? And there might be other ways of doing it. I was just thinking of doing it, you know, on top of one another, so that you would actually superimpose the original with your transformation of the original.
Yeah, I've tried that as
simultaneous.
well, actually, to have some fragments of the
Exactly.
original.
Exactly. So that
Yeah.
so that the original would become recognizable in a sense, but not in terms of the original. But as the echo of the original, which I think in a way resonates more with what you are doing.
Exactly, thank you, because there is no original.
No.
So there's no. I see what you mean. Already saying this is the original is
somehow
is counter
yes,
to the whole
counterproductive
process,
and
absolutely.
a bit contradictory. I am curious. Well, you talked about, you actually talked about musical practice, profound connections to, I think, even macro-political systems of power. You didn't say so much about that. I was just wondering, can you elaborate a little bit more on that, on how it sort of factually connects with these systems of power? Because, I mean, there are systems at work in our music community that are hierarchical, that are patriarchal, masculine, and so on and so forth, that are extremely strong. So by doing what you do, you also actually negotiate with that kind of power structures. But are there even other... You talk about macro-political power structures.
Yeah, actually my whole point is that these micro-political structures are predicated upon structures that can be shared by, you know, this such an obsolete and niche practice as my own, but are not directly reflected in that. So of course, there are all sorts of policies to counter anti-discriminative practices in music, as in the other arts, which I fully subscribe to, like, you know, being more careful to who you're hiring. Also, museums expose statistics, this kind of strategies. Yeah, absolutely. But to me, this is something that operates at a different level. To me, as an artist, I would like to enter the specificities of what I do and there detect these micro-political structures that then reverberate. So actually this was, again, an overly ambitious enterprise that I set myself upon, but by showing how, you know, the audible is categorized, is framed within this grid, which is the partiture, and which reflects so much this optical grid approach to the real. Well, this is also a very similar process as a minoritarian materiality, which is excluded, which is has a relation to the major structure, which is of violence sometimes, even of not seeing. There are things that we don't see. And I claim that trained musicians don't listen. They have lost the capacity to listen. This I tested in some concrete examples. And to me, this has more to do, you know, with discrimination of minorities and than you know, big demonstrative moves, which are very important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be very careful about that, but to me, as artists, that's where we can really operate. And again, the relation between micro-political and macro-political is very mysterious. And again, I also have the humility to say, yes, this is only music.
I think we should open up for questions from the audience. And I have difficulties. I see a hand there. I see a hand up. I think that was the first hand. And then there is a hand here. So we'll have some questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Julie Smith Andreasen. I'm coming from choreography, so when I hear about scores, I think about choreographic scores. I'm just wondering how important is time for you, because you said you were relating to very old traditional music, and you're playing something very contemporary. And is it important, because there's such a big difference as I hear it in the sound, what we produce today and what was produced then, and maybe that's the whole point. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is it important to have the recognition of the composer, imagining that he would accept your work? Or does it matter if he would be very provoked or even deny the fact that you are playing his work?
Uh-huh. Thanks for this question. Well, by time you mean chronological time, like historical time. Yeah. So yes, these two examples which I showed, so at the beginning I was really much more comfortable working with very old music, precisely because this difference comes to the fore. So I was really interested in difference. But later I've been working with 19th century composers, also, you know, iconic like Beethoven or Schumann. That was quite more difficult, but let's say that operationally, I think it's possible with every kind of score as a provocation. Of course, there are what a score is in constant renegotiation, and not all of them are so linear and so optical. But let's say with rhythmic diastematic notation could be possible with any score. Actually, my supervisor told me back then, okay, now you try the same with Brian Ferney.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, okay. I could not, because I can only work with pieces that I know very intimately. So I would have, you know, first to study really the score of Ferney or a listening of Ferney, and then do it. But it's possible. And for your second question, the recognition of the author. Well, first of all, we should ask, you know, if Monteverdi came here and listened to, you know, a convergent performance, what he would think. And we cannot know. And my answer is, perhaps I can use again Carmelo Bene when he said, you know, I don't do Shakespeare, I am Shakespeare. So I am Monteverdi, of course I agree. Thank you.
There's a question, I think, over here to begin with.
Hi Lucia, my name is Jonas. I play guitar too, so I really enjoyed your performance.
Thank you.
I guess my question is, it's not a question, I would just like maybe if you can sort of give an example how, because the score of your first example, I guess just contains, you know, value, note of value and time and dynamics. So like how, for instance, do you make a 3-note chord turn into an effect which is like scratching with your nails? How does that sort of happen?
So by the first score, you mean what Monteverdi notated?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for this question. It's interesting because while referring to a primary work, I don't refer only to a score. So I refer again to the work as a divergent series. So part of the work is the score, but with it comes also a performative tradition. With it comes a series of listening experiences that I have, a series of information about who Monteverdi was, what his context was, what came after him, because of him, before him. So again, it's an infinite series. So it's, again, it's important, your question, because I don't look for an optical relation between notation and a new form of notation. So it's not that I, you know, take the elements, the pitches, the durations, the chords, and then transpose them into another system of notation, but I work as a performer, from the performative. And the performative is characterized by unclarity in my experience. So sound, to me, is a mystery. The listening experience has no explanation. We cannot know what it is. It's materially infinite. So in that respect, I wanted to liberate some of this infinity, okay, and not close it, again, make it converge in entities that are internotatable. Then, of course, you are right. If I sit and notate this, I can. I actually did. I produced the score of this Divergent performance. So notation always wins. But for it to win, we have to accept its rules, its off. If we don't, then we start thinking in another way. That's my whole point. I hope to have answered your question.
Thank you. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, I'd like to. Yes, Erling, please.
Yeah, thank you for an interesting talk. It relates to the past and the original. So I'm thinking, my first question is like, do you sometimes use several different scores and combine them? Because that would be a different idea of thinking about time, that multiple times coexist, for example. And the follow-up on that, and would that also make the respect for the original diminish? And the other one is, would you say that Hense, the composer Hense, is doing this? Because he would be taking things from multiple composers, say like Berio also does, or, you know. So are they doing what you're doing, or are you doing something different?
Well, thank you. Also very important points. So with the first question, you mean different scores, like different works, or different editions of the same work?
No, I'm thinking like taking Monteverdi and Vivaldi, and or I'm thinking. I mean, I mentioned Hense. He will quote from, or not quote, but compose and really reconfigure multiple composers, or in the vernacular, like hip hop, you know, takes hundreds of samples and makes something completely new. Which is a different time-space conception.
I understand. Yes, actually, in the process, it happened sometimes spontaneously that fragments from other works entered. So, for example, I was doing a work on Diabelli Variations by Beethoven, and I was struck by the similarity of some configuration with Dichterliebe by Schumann. So it was a strategy that happened. I never actually formalized it, but thank you for that. And actually, at the time, I was working in a project that did precisely that, actually with, you know, very recognizable pieces, but like to show this radical openness. So in a performance of Schumann's Kreisleriana, for example, we would insert Beethoven, we would insert I don't remember, Chopin, to show actually that there is this multiplicity of times always co-present within our understanding of the score. It was not a specificity of this project. And to answer your second question, which is very important, yes, of course, this has been done. Another inspiration of mine was Salvatore Sciarrino, who actually brings in, you know, plays with history in a very clever, very sensitive way. I think there is a big fundamental difference between what they do and what I do, namely that I am not, again, a composer. I am a performer. And the performer is always a marginalized entity in music and keeps being so, also because performers want this. So it's the Hegelian slave that actually enjoys very much this position. So I'm not, you know, criticizing composers for what they do. But if you start from this questioning of also division of labor in music, you cannot accept anymore what Sciarrino or Hense are doing, because again, it's a score, again, it's a work, again, it's a sedimentation that is also signed, that comes with all sorts of economic, political, implications. So that's the difference, which to me is very important.
And I think that, for example, Sharina would probably have not accept a transformation of his, for example, say Capricci, you know, by you.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So there is this. It's sort of you know, with a composer actually doing this kind of interpretative or sort of transformational work on other original works, like, for example, you mentioned Berio also. What they actually do is that they then make a score that is not up for negotiation.
Right.
Yeah, and that is the big difference. So that's also a big question, I think, for the research. How can we elaborate with, you know, contemporary compositional strategies in such a way that they actually open up for that specific type of transformational performance? Yeah, just as a comment. Are there other questions? Yes, please.
The mic is closed. Thank you very much for the talk. You said initially that the word "of" is your favorite word in every occasion. But we think in terms of cultural theory, quite often, almost always, "of" is placed alongside "for", because when you talk about representation, many things, there are representations of things, but also representations for things. So if you have a blueprint of a house, it's a representation of the house to what it looked like, but also a way of building the house. I mean, it's made to use it. So I'm just thinking in terms, so you're not talking about linearity like you do in the title and the non-linearity of the future. Is this only about reconfiguration of the musical past, or is it also reconfiguration for the musical past, the more performative sense?
Oh, yeah, thank you very much for this question. I hope it is. I hope it is actually, because this, of course, comes with consequences also, as you were suggesting, on how this historical tradition is perceived and used and appreciated, which at the moment, maybe I've been a bit too negative about it, but its role seems to be at the best consolatory or informative, which I think is not what we need today. There are so many other practices that can, you know, fulfill those needs, and I don't think that this does justice to what this repertoire has to offer. So yeah, I would like to see it. 4 could be a nice substitute. Thank you.
Oh, there's a question. There's a question.
Thank you. It was super interesting to hear you speak of your projects. And I have actually 2 questions. The first one is about when you were talking about your methodology, you said about the subtraction. You spoke first of how you select some parts of the composition of the score and you repeat some, erase some, play some. And then you talked about a subtraction, and maybe I don't remember the words correctly, of subjective, at the time of performing, of a subjective presence and narrative. And I'm wondering, how do you make this selection from the original score? If you think of ways of subtracting the subjectivity from that selection process, or if it is possible to do it without creating a narrative again.
This is the most difficult question, and it's actually very urgent, and I shy away from answering that sometimes, but it's central. It's central. So on a very practical level, what I selected, again, it's the logic of the punctum by Barthes. So you are hit by something. You are hit by something that is not. It cannot be a pitch. It cannot be a duration. It's a trait. It's an effect. And you try to understand what that effect could become when you yourself do something with it. So it can, you know, re-emerge in a way that is very different. And yeah, this loss of narrativity and subjectification, well, I think this is really a paradoxical move, because narrativity is always there. It always, you know, you try to get away with it, it recreates itself. Interpretation is always there. You know, the surrealist experimented with all the most absurd combinations, and still you can interpret them. You can find the narrative. So it's stronger. It's a too powerful enemy. So I don't think I succeeded, of course, because, you know, if you go too far in losing subjectivity, it becomes very dangerous on a practical level. You lose sociality, you lose your life at some point. So I cannot, of course, go there. But I think the attempt is valuable in itself. And to me, also this, you know, process of being affected so hardly by something is already bringing myself out of, you know, my will, my centrality, my intentionality. And again, going back to Francis Bacon, he himself uses this beautiful word for what he was doing. He said that he had the will to lose the will. Of course, it's paradoxical, but it was a bit what I tried to do. Also, it was a very random, very almost absent-minded process by which I came to these performances, and also very hard to trace back because of that. And as Francis Bacon said, never successful. So to me, these are never successful endeavors, because they're predicated upon this subtraction and negativity. So yeah, at some point I gave up, because it's also very tiring. So I don't do this anymore. It's also very time-consuming. You have to be with these pieces, also beautiful. But yeah, it's very hard to phrase how you try to lose subjectivity. It's very hard to phrase.
May I offer a reflection on that, exactly that, because I understood more that your selection from the original was highly subjective, and that was and really sort of, it was very affectuous.
Yeah.
But then in the performance, when sort of meeting yourself, you know, meeting your subjectivity again, as it were, in performance, you would attempt to lose subjectivity. So again, creating a distance between sort of subjectivity and objectivity, as it were. Is that correct?
I think both. So both in the process of selection, as you say, it's really subjective, but to me it's really this affect, in a Spinozian sense, also is the middle way between subject and object. So I'm a bit brought out of my own centeredness as a subject, but also, as you say, in the staging, and that's also part of why I chose also to have two people on stage for that particular occasion, not always, but also to decenter myself but of course, again...
you don't succeed.
I don't. I never succeed.
Right. There was one question over here.
I'm going to try to formulate it. I'm not sure how to formulate this, but I was curious about if you have had considerations, because I've been working as an interpreter also of score for many, many years, and one thing that I didn't hear so much about, but maybe just a little bit now, that you mentioned the two people on stage, and this also the process of interpretation in relation to the space, you know, like diverging from the space and the stage, and, you know, because you say that you also use not only the score itself, but like the story, like the context before, within it, and the future, and, you know, so how do you relate that also in terms of like being presenting this divergent piece, but in a very traditional way, which is on a stage, and how does that, you know, how do you deal with that, or have you thought about also diverging from that process, or like that part of the performance?
Yes, that's a very good question, thank you. And actually, with the group I was working with at the time, this was kind of central to our strategy, so we did experiment a lot with deplacing the stage, or spreading the stage, using the walls, using the ceiling, using I mean, it's also nothing new if you think of, it's a practice that has been going on for decades now in contemporary music, but still to present, canonic works in this way. For that particular performance, I actually wanted to play a bit with traditionality, so to be, to have a recital. It was really a recital with a set of pieces that have nothing to do with each other, like, a big singer or guitarist just composes this absurd potpourri of works. And I was on stage, completely mobilized, as, the central subject is all the time, but also by doubling myself with this figure. She's a dancer, actually, so she was not producing any sounds, and she was kind of embodying, you could not see that in that clip, but she was embodying a kind of extreme affective reaction to what she heard. So she was really, vibrating and moving all the time in a also quite uncanny manner. So through this doubling, I was trying to decentralize and diverge from myself and show, I'm on stage, but I'm already double. I'm listening while playing already. So that fixity, that immobility was part of the thematization happening there as well. Thank you.
I think we're coming to a close. But we might have time for one brief question. I'm not going to try to summarize any of this, but here we have one more question. Yes, please.
Thank you. Just a short one. It's like, can I sort of, maybe I can I get the feeling sort of that there might be, can you say that there might be a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, sort of like...
Sorry, I did not get the word.
Like what I'm trying to say is like if there's a comment on just composing in general from your side.
A comment? You mean a negative comment?
No, it just like positive and negative, and just like a comment on what does it mean to compose.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of that part in play in your work, or?
I would say absolutely, not only composing, but again, this division of labor which comes between performer, composer, and audience, which is, for all the attempts to bridge and to eliminate this gap, is still there very prominently. So I would say, yes, it is a comment on what it means to compose, and still to this day I don't call myself a composer, because I don't start from that logic. Not to say that there is one logic of composition, of course, there are billions, but still, they also reality, and again, thinking of oneself as a kind of super object that synchronizes events in time through sound, that I don't do. So in that respect, yes, I'm thematizing also the composer and the performer.
So, yeah, I would like to thank you and maybe offer just one word to the discussion, which would be contingency in the discussion about kind of the international intentionality, loss of subjectivity, and so on. I think, the aspect of all artistic creation as contingent on a set of different parameters, be they time, space, or materiality, or beyond, I think it's an important maybe addition to the discussion, but then, in the way also that, for example, all science fiction is always more actually about the present than about the future. It's also a testimony to that kind of contingency. But then I sense in this, and in your work, Lucia, also a diffraction of being locked to that one time and space in which we are forced to create, and which we are contingent in, and which our acts of creation are kind of getting marked by. And I think that's maybe a beautiful reconfiguration to think further with. So I thank you for this, for opening up this, and thank you, Ole, for your engaging conversation. Yeah.
Thanks to you, and thanks to all.